An age-old question in the One Piece fandom has always been, what will the final iteration of these Straw Hats look like? Since the very beginning of the story, we've known that Luffy wants 10 other people on his crew, which means the Straw Hats allegedly need one more member to complete their final roster. This question gets discussed all the time, even in today's current One Piece environment, and I think the reason for that is obviously that there is a ton of different candidates to fill that final elusive Straw Hat role. However, to the dismay of many fans, a lot of people do not realize that Oda has already put the cap on the Straw Hat crew, and there will not be another Straw Hat. I know that probably sounds blasphemous considering the amount of discussion surrounding who that elusive final member would be. However, I think if you watch this video to the end and lend me an ear, I do believe you'll also agree with me that there will not be another Straw Hat in the story. We're going to go through it all. The formula that Oda has used to introduce Straw Hats into the story in the past, the current candidates that everybody's talking about and why they wouldn't fit into the crew, and also talking about that line in the beginning of the story where Luffy says he wants 10 additional crewmates. If you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you could subscribe, and let's get into it. Of all the commonly discussed candidates to become that last Straw Hat, in my opinion, there are 4 obvious contenders that get the most spotlight from the community. But before we talk about those 4 contenders, I want to talk about the formula that Oda has consistently used for introducing Straw Hats into the story before they end up on the crew. I think most fans are extremely familiar with this formula, so I won't go too in-depth, but I think it's important to recap because we're going to use this formula to determine if those 4 candidates would fit into the crew anyway. The first and most obvious piece of this formula that Oda uses to introduce Straw Hats is that the Straw Hats liberate this friend from a problem that is occurring in the story, and that problem is usually something that stands in the way of the Straw Hats anyway. This has remained consistent with every Straw Hat, which makes sense because liberation is a huge theme in One Piece. You can go through them all very quickly and see that it is consistent amongst almost every Straw Hat apart from one, which we'll get to in a minute. Luffy saving Zoro from Axe-Head Morgan, saving Usopp from Captain Kuro, Sanji and Don Krieg, but also Sanji's debt to Zeph and his desire to stay and help his savior. Nami's an obvious one with Arlong Park. Chopper with Wapol and the Drum Kingdom. Robin, although it's an extremely long character arc, but obviously the world government. Frankie and the world government also after him and the blueprints to the Pluton. Brook and his shadow with Gecko Moria. And then of course there's Jimbe, who doesn't exactly fall into this formula, but again, we'll get to him in a second. The second criteria that Oda has used for these Straw Hats is that they get a backstory. In most cases, this backstory takes place during the conflict that these Straw Hats are helping this person with. However, there are instances where this person gets a backstory after the fact, before the fact, or even an additional backstory later in the story, so the placement of the backstory doesn't exactly matter. All that's important is that there is some sort of backstory or motivation for this character stemming from their childhood or a previous point in their life. And lastly, something that has remained consistent with every Straw Hat that Oda has introduced, something that a lot of people might not realize, is that they are all from pre-time skip. Now again, for the third time, you're probably thinking of Jimbe, who is an exception to all of these rules, and let me explain why he is deliberately an exception to all the criteria that Oda used with the previous Straw Hats. Let's work backwards and start with introduced in pre-time skip. Yes, I'm aware that Jimbe officially joins the crew in Wano, which is post-time skip, or some consider the moment that Jimbe donates blood to Luffy the moment that he joins the crew, that is also post-time skip. However, what's important here is that Jimbe is introduced in the pre-time skip during the Marineford saga, which is where we really learn a lot about his character and he gets to shine for the first time. Working backwards again, Jimbe doesn't exactly have a backstory. He's part of a larger backstory with Arlong and Fisher Tiger, which I would consider a Jimbe backstory, but he doesn't have a backstory that he is the spotlight of like all the other Straw Hats, so again, this is an exception to the rule. And lastly, going back to the first criteria I mentioned, Jimbe doesn't exactly have a problem that the Straw Hats help liberate him from. He's not from an island that the Straw Hats come to save. He doesn't have a problem that Luffy comes to fix. It's actually the inverse, which is exactly why I think he falls against the criteria that I've established in this video thus far. Jimbe is deliberately different from all of the other Straw Hats introduced thus far. And I think the reason for that is that he's meant to be the last Straw Hat. If you think about it like this, it actually gets quite simple. It would make sense that the last Straw Hat, instead of being someone that these Straw Hats save or liberate from a problem, is someone who saved Luffy from probably the worst moment in his entire life when Ace died. The last Straw Hat doesn't get a focused backstory where they are the focal point of some kind of sad story, but rather they are a character that has existed in the living and breathing world of One Piece previously and is getting ushered into the crew, into this new role in the story. Jimbe brings up the rear quite literally. He is constantly saving Luffy as opposed to Luffy saving his friends like what usually happens. He doesn't follow the criteria that Oda has previously established for the Straw Hats because he's meant to be that cap on the crew. No one comes after Jimbe because he's the final Straw Hat. But what about those 4 candidates I was talking about? A lot of them fulfill these criteria very well, and they're also introduced in the post-time skip, which doesn't really make sense for the whole pre-time skip criteria I just mentioned. Well, let's go through these 4 main candidates and explain why I don't think they're going to be Straw Hats. The first candidate is a character whose time, in my opinion, has passed, and not many people vouch for this person becoming a Straw Hat anymore, and that is Carrot. A lot of people assumed Carrot was going to be the next Straw Hat because of the amount of time she spent on the Thousand Sunny and the amount of different arcs she had an important role in. However, when you stack Carrot's character up to the Straw Hat formula we mentioned previously in this video, she was just never going to be this role. Carrot doesn't exactly have a character-focused backstory. She does have a little bit of a glimpse of her past in the story, but it's not that compelling, and it really doesn't compare to any of the other Straw Hats as far as magnitude. In fact, in the same vein, I don't think she's even the most important Mink from the Zou arc, and the Zou arc itself is so small compared to the large-scale arcs that Oda likes to write that it didn't exactly fit into the Straw Hat formula in the first place. And of course, the biggest reason, Carrot's already out of the story. Her character arc has concluded, she's the current Duke of Zou because Dogstorm and Cat Viper are on Wano. She has fulfilled her purpose in the story and is now pretty much obsolete until the final war comes around, so Carrot is pretty easy to rule out. The next and probably most controversial candidate is Yamato, or by extension, the entire Wano crew of Yamato, Kinemon, and Momonosuke. A lot of people believed Yamato would join the crew because she's supposed to be Odin, and Odin sailed with Roger to the One Piece, so she would be that sort of late game pickup that Roger had for Luffy's crew. However, in my opinion, there was just too much wrong with Yamato's character for this to be a good writing choice from Oda. The greatest part of Yamato's character arc, part of which we haven't even seen yet, is her realizing that she's not supposed to be Odin, she's rather supposed to be herself, because Odin made a lot of mistakes when it came to governing Wano. We see that his absence from the country allowed Kaido to take over, we see that his foolishness in believing everything Orochi said caused the demise of his empire, and I think it would make for a lot more of a compelling character if Yamato realized that Odin did make a lot of mistakes. He's not someone exactly worth idolizing over entirely, and that if Yamato was to protect Momonosuke and Wano correctly, she would not join the Straw Hats. And we do get to see a glimpse of that in the end of Wano, which I was extremely happy about, because if Yamato just continued to declare that she was Odin and got a free ticket onto the Straw Hats just like that, I think she'd be a really poor character, considering her backstory is actually pretty lacking unless you go look at the anime original content. And that her quote-unquote liberation when compared to other Straw Hats in the story was sort of insignificant when you compare it to the rest of the events happening in Wano. You could make an argument that once Yamato's character arc is complete and she realizes that she shouldn't be Odin, rather she should fulfill her own role in the current Wano, that she could come join as the last Straw Hat. However, I think the existence of Momonosuke and Kinemon make me believe that these 3 are going to come back and fulfill their role in the final war as more of a Grand Fleet role, rather than Yamato separating from these 2 and becoming a Straw Hat, because these 3, in my opinion, are a tight-knit group, and I think they should stay together for the rest of the story. The next, and at the time, most promising candidate is Bonnie. For the longest time, Bonnie fulfilled most of the criteria established by Oda to become a Straw Hat. She was introduced at the beginning of an arc. There was very clearly a problem that aligned with what the Straw Hats were doing at the time. That problem was fixed or liberated by the Straw Hats on Egghead Island. We got an extended backstory and her entire life story during the Egghead Island arc. Her dynamic with the crew was really good. She was a previously established character in the story, so there wouldn't have to be too much work to become a Straw Hat here. So everything was looking great until the current arc of the manga. If there was a time for Bonnie to join the Straw Hats, I think it would be at the end of Egghead Island, as it's the last sort of break the Straw Hats would have before this climactic final war that's about to happen. But none of that happened. We've gotten to Elbaf, and Bonnie's character has pretty much been discarded by Oda. She's somewhere with the Vegapunk satellites, as well as Kuma just hiding on Elbaf as everything goes down. So because I think Oda has missed his window to officially make Bonnie a Straw Hat, and has also kept Vegapunk and Kuma with Bonnie at this time, I think it's very possible that Bonnie also ends up playing a Grand Fleet role similar to Yamato, or also has a greater role with the revolutionaries because of her father Kuma. So like I said, although Bonnie was probably the most likely out of all of these candidates, I think her window has passed. And lastly, the current talk of the town, Loki in the Elbaf arc. Similar to Bonnie, Loki is slowly fulfilling all of the criteria that I mentioned to become a Straw Hat. His backstory is currently underway. He seems to have a clear problem that aligns with exactly what the Straw Hats are trying to fix on Elbaf. And he seems to be a really compelling character with an amazing dynamic with a lot of the Straw Hats, something that I absolutely love to read in One Piece. However, I think there are a ton of logistical as well as writing problems if Loki were to end up on the Straw Hats. Starting with logistical problems, it's kinda hard to have one of the biggest giants in the series on the Thousand Sunny realistically. It doesn't make sense for Loki to be an official Straw Hat if he has to travel separately from the crew. Not only that, Loki's bounty is gigantic, it's almost Luffy's bounty, and I think the monster trio of Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji has been so solidified for the entire story. Throwing in someone who's arguably on that level or even higher kind of destroys that dynamic that Oda has built up for the longest time. And while I do think Loki's character arc is going to reveal that he's a really good guy, and he will have a major part in liberating Elbaf and saving the country from its current conflict, I again think it's possible that Loki ends up playing a Grand Fleet sort of role, similar to what Dory and Bragi have played throughout the story and what they will continue to play. After all, we see this person who looks exactly like Loki in the legendary mural panel, so I think it's pretty likely that Loki will end up helping the Straw Hats in the final war against the world government, but to do so as a Straw Hat has just too many logistical holes, and I really don't think it's that possible. Those are the main reasons why I think those 4 candidates specifically don't work as Straw Hats, but if you still don't believe me, let me explain why I don't think any character fits in the Straw Hats, regardless of how they specifically would fit into the crew, and how it has nothing to do with the specific character, but rather the structure of the story. Even if any of the 4 characters I just mentioned fit every criteria perfectly and would make for a great Straw Hat, I don't think it would work anyway. There is just so little time left in the story after the Elbaf arc that I don't think we have the time to fully flesh out and establish a new Straw Hat when there's so much else going on in the story. Developing a character takes a ton of panel space and story time, and Oda does not like to half-ass his characters, especially if they are Straw Hats. We simply just do not have the amount of time left in the story, especially with the current environment of the One Piece world, to be dedicating panel space and story time for a character to be completely fleshed out. In fact, we've already seen certain Straw Hats fall off in relevance in the end of post-timeskip because of the insane amount of characters Oda wants to introduce in various arcs. In Dressrosa, you had the Grand Fleet. In Wano, you had the Scabbards. Just the inclusion of these characters left certain other characters out of the limelight for way too long. Hell, Dressrosa had half of the Straw Hats on purpose because there was way too many characters to focus on, and the inclusion of these Scabbards in Wano made it so that characters like Brook and Usopp had literally nothing to do with the narrative. Including another Straw Hat is a dangerous pull from Oda. It would make it so that all the characters in the story have to have less character moments, less screen time, and they would become less compelling by default. Not only that, the group dynamic is already extremely established. Like I mentioned way in the beginning of this video, I think the fact that all the current Straw Hats were introduced in pre-timeskip makes it so that the group dynamic has been established for such a long time and can't really be broken or reintroduced. Oda knew that when he entered the second act of One Piece, the post-timeskip saga, he realized it was going to get a lot more serious, and there wouldn't be time to re-establish group dynamics or create a sort of silly funny vibe that pre-timeskip had. This is why all the current Straw Hats were introduced in the pre-timeskip, because it was the best environment for them to thrive and create relationships with each other. There is just no time for that sort of dilly-dallying to happen now. But what about that panel in the beginning of One Piece where Luffy says he wants 10 additional crewmates, not counting himself, meaning there is still 1 vacant spot? Oda wouldn't obviously go back on his word when such a potent panel exists in the story. It just can't be ignored. Well, there's obviously one more character that I have not mentioned in this video that you're probably thinking of right now that fixes this entire problem. Of course, I'm talking about Vivi. Vivi fixes literally every problem I mentioned with an additional Straw Hat. First, she fits perfectly into the formula of a Straw Hat. She was a friend who had a problem that was liberated by the Straw Hats, obviously the giant conflict of Alabasta. We have her entire backstory already in the Alabasta arc. It's an extremely compelling backstory that moved a lot of people, and also fits with the greater themes of One Piece. And of course, she was introduced in pre-timeskip way before a lot of these Straw Hats were introduced, so that's no problem. Not only that, everything I just mentioned about panel time and story time needed to build up a character wouldn't matter, as Vivi has already been established as an amazing character with a lot of different nuances and themes in the story. There would be no need for Oda to go out of his way to derail the story to build up an entire new character when Vivi is already such an amazing character in the story, especially since her importance has skyrocketed since the death of her father at the hands of Emu. I think Vivi would be an amazing Straw Hat based on everything I've said about her character already, but just now that the fact that she has insane ties to the Void Century, as well as an insane importance with Luffy now, I think it just makes perfect sense for her to be reintroduced into the story. She's going to play a huge role in the final war, as well as linking the Void Century flashback to the present day. She's a fantastic character, already fleshed out. No need for Oda to go out of his way to force in character development when Vivi is already such a great character. And honestly, by the looks of it, it seems like she's already on her way to the Straw Hats, considering at the beginning of the Elbaf arc, we saw the X on Luffy's arm in the newspaper. She's currently trying to communicate with the Straw Hats based on the news she got about her father. It is all but confirmed that Vivi is going to be the last Straw Hat. On top of that, I have seen a lot of people complain that Vivi is just not strong enough to make it onto the Straw Hats, especially in this endgame environment where the enemies are extremely powerful. But to those people, I say you are missing the entire point of Luffy's character. The reason he's getting strong in the first place is not to destroy all these people and become the Pirate King. He just needs to be strong to protect his friends, even if they're weak, because he wants to have people on his crew regardless of how strong they are. So it wouldn't matter if Vivi can't hold her own in a fight, because these Straw Hats aren't meant to be this typical Yonko level crew where everyone has haki and is a monster of strength. Luffy purposely picks whoever he wants to pick regardless of how weak they are, because his crew is just built like that. And of course, everyone in the Straw Hats has a role. A lot of people like to say that Vivi wouldn't have a specific role, meaning she wouldn't fit into the story. Well, I think it's pretty obvious that Vivi would serve as the diplomat of the Straw Hats, but I think as these Straw Hats continue to rise and rise in the One Piece world, especially becoming a force formidable enough to rival the world government, they're going to need some kind of negotiator or diplomat. And of course, like I just mentioned, Vivi is so intertwined with the world government and the history of the world that I think her inclusion on the Straw Hats just makes perfect sense, and the role she would fulfill is a diplomat, someone who acts as the voice of reason in the Straw Hats, and someone who will probably be a major player in the final war. Thank you for watching all the way to the end of the video. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Leave a comment what you think about those 4 candidates I mentioned in this video. Are there any candidates that I missed? Do you think one of those candidates is going to join the Straw Hats and I'll end up being incorrect? Do you think a Straw Hat is going to join the crew and it's someone who we haven't even seen yet? There's a ton of possibilities and I'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching, and until next time.